You know who the real heroes are? A voice would later ask. They're usually the ones nobody notices until everything goes wrong. On a cool Friday evening in Norfolk, Virginia, Emily Carter finally stepped out of the hospital after a 12-hour shift that felt twice as long. Her feet ached, her shoulders were tense, and all she wanted was 30 minutes of quiet before heading home. The emergency department had been packed since sunrise, and the steady stream of patients had barely slowed all day. As she walked toward her car, she noticed a text message from a coworker inviting her to a small gathering at a neighborhood bar only a few blocks away. Normally, Emily would have declined. She preferred a hot shower and a good night's sleep. But something about the exhausting day convinced her that a cold drink and a few friendly conversations might be exactly what she needed. The bar was busy but welcoming. Soft country music played through the speakers while baseball highlights flickered across several television screens. Most people were laughing, relaxing, and enjoying the start of the weekend. Emily found an empty stool near the center of the room and ordered a sparkling water. She still had another shift early the next morning and never liked feeling tired at work. For a few minutes, everything seemed peaceful. Then the conversation beside her changed. A group of men at a nearby table had been discussing careers, salaries, and accomplishments. One of them noticed Emily's hospital badge hanging from her purse and casually asked what she did for a living. "I'm a nurse," Emily answered with a polite smile. The reaction was immediate. One man chuckled. Another exchanged a grin with his friends. "Just a nurse," someone said. The others laughed. Emily had heard comments like that before. Not often, but enough to recognize the tone. It was not curiosity. It was dismissal. She took a slow breath and remained calm. "That's right," she said. "I'm a nurse." The group continued joking among themselves. They talked as if she were not sitting a few feet away. One claimed nurses only followed instructions. Another suggested anyone could do the job with enough practice. Their comments drew a few uncomfortable looks from people nearby, but nobody said anything. Emily simply sipped her drink and kept her composure. Years in emergency medicine had taught her that not every misunderstanding needed an argument. Across the room, however, someone was paying close attention. Seated alone near the back wall was a tall man in a dark jacket. He had arrived nearly an hour earlier and spent most of the evening quietly observing the room. He had not introduced himself to anyone. He had not joined any conversations. Yet his eyes occasionally drifted toward the group, making jokes about the nurse. The man seemed unimpressed. Emily never noticed him. She was too busy pretending the comments did not bother her. But as the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the bar slowly shifted. The laughter grew louder. The jokes became more personal. And somewhere beneath the music, the conversations, and the clinking glasses, the first signs of a much bigger moment were beginning to take shape. Emily looked down at her glass and reminded herself that she had survived far more difficult situations than a few careless comments. During her years in emergency medicine, she had comforted frightened families, worked through natural disasters, and helped people through some of the worst days of their lives. Compared to that, a handful of strangers making jokes in a bar should not have mattered. Yet the words lingered longer than she wanted to admit. The group continued talking loudly. They seemed energized by their own humor. One of the men leaned back in his chair and said that people often exaggerated how demanding medical jobs were. Another claimed that real pressure belonged to executives, business owners, and military personnel. Emily remained silent. She had learned long ago that some people were not looking for a conversation. They were looking for an audience. A waitress passing by noticed the uncomfortable situation and offered Emily an apologetic smile. Emily returned the smile and thanked her. She had no intention of letting the evening be ruined. Across the room, the man in the dark jacket continued watching without drawing attention to himself. He appeared relaxed, but his eyes missed very little. He noticed how Emily carefully avoided escalating the situation. He noticed how she refused to insult anyone back. Most importantly, he noticed that she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility. The group at the nearby table noticed none of this. They continued making assumptions based solely on a job title. A few minutes later, one of the televisions above the bar switched from baseball highlights to a local news segment. The volume was low, but a headline about healthcare staffing challenges appeared on the screen. Emily glanced up briefly. Before she could look away, one of the men laughed again. "There you go," he said. "Everyone acts like nurses are carrying the whole country on their shoulders." Several of his friends chuckled. Emily finally turned toward them. Her voice remained calm and professional. Most nurses are just trying to help people get home safely to their families. The answer should have ended the discussion. Instead, it created a short silence that seemed to challenge the group more than any argument would have. One of the men shrugged and said, "Sure, but it is not exactly saving the world." Emily considered responding. Then she decided against it. There was no point. She simply turned back toward the counter. The bartender, a middle-aged man named Frank, had been listening from several feet away. He had owned the establishment for nearly 20 years and had developed a good sense for reading people. What impressed him was not Emily's patience alone. It was the fact that she never once tried to prove herself. People who truly carried responsibility rarely felt the need to announce it. The evening continued, and the energy in the room gradually returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked. A country song played through the speakers. For a moment, it seemed the tension had finally passed. Then a sudden sound interrupted everything. A chair scraped sharply against the floor. Several heads turned. An older customer sitting near the far end of the bar appeared unsteady. He reached for the counter as if trying to regain his balance. The room grew quiet. The man looked confused. His expression changed. Before anyone could fully understand what was happening, he began to slump forward. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People rose from their seats. A few patrons exchanged worried looks. Nobody seemed sure what to do next. Frank immediately moved around the counter, concern written across his face. The group that had spent the evening laughing fell silent. The atmosphere changed completely in a matter of seconds. Emily was already standing before anyone else reacted. The exhaustion from her 12-hour shift vanished beneath years of training and experience. Her focus narrowed instantly. While others stared in uncertainty, she was already moving toward the older man. And from the corner of the room, the stranger in the dark jacket watched closely as the moment that would change the entire night finally arrived. Emily reached the older man within seconds. By the time several customers had stepped away from their tables, she was already beside him, speaking in a calm, steady voice. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked. The man appeared disoriented. His eyes were open, but he seemed unable to focus on the people around him. Frank arrived a moment later, clearly concerned. "What do you need?" he asked. Emily appreciated the question. Panic often spread when emergencies happened in public places, but Frank was focused. "Call 911 and tell them we have a medical emergency," Emily said. "Then please give us some room." Frank nodded immediately and reached for his phone. Around them, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The loud conversations were gone. The laughter had disappeared. Every person in the bar seemed to be watching. Emily remained focused on the older man. She introduced herself and continued speaking clearly, hoping to keep him engaged. Years of experience had taught her that reassurance could be just as important as technical skill. She quickly gathered information from those nearby. The man was a regular customer. His name was Walter. He was 72 years old and usually stopped by on Friday evenings after dinner. One of his friends mentioned that he had complained about feeling unusually tired earlier in the day. Emily listened carefully while continuing her assessment. She remained composed despite the dozens of eyes fixed on her. To her, the crowded room disappeared. There was only the patient in front of her. The group of men who had mocked her earlier stood several feet away. Their expressions had changed dramatically. None of them were laughing now. One of them looked as though he wanted to say something, but no words came out. For the first time that evening, they were seeing Emily not as a stereotype or a job title, but as a professional carrying real responsibility. She asked Walter simple questions and carefully monitored his responses. Every answer gave her another piece of information. Every second mattered, yet she never appeared rushed. Her voice remained calm and reassuring. That calmness began affecting everyone around her. Customers who had looked frightened moments earlier started following her instructions. Someone brought a folded jacket when she requested additional support. Another customer cleared space nearby. A waitress quietly helped redirect curious onlookers. Without realizing it, the room had begun taking its cues from Emily. Across the bar, the tall stranger in the dark jacket continued watching. His attention never left the scene. Unlike the others, he was studying details. He noticed how Emily communicated. He noticed her confidence. He noticed how naturally people responded to her leadership. Most importantly, he noticed that she never sought attention for herself. She focused entirely on helping another person. The stranger's expression softened slightly. It was the first visible reaction he had shown all evening. Several minutes passed. To those watching, it felt much longer. Then faint sirens became audible somewhere in the distance. The sound brought visible relief to many people in the room. Emily continued monitoring Walter and speaking with him. Little by little, he seemed more responsive. The tension began easing. Frank exhaled deeply. He had been holding his breath without realizing it. One of the men from the group finally stepped forward. His voice was noticeably quieter than before. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked. Emily glanced up briefly. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass anyone. "Just keep the area clear," she said. "That will help." The man nodded immediately. Within seconds, he was encouraging others to step back and give space. The transformation was impossible to ignore. Less than an hour earlier, he had been making jokes. Now he was following instructions without hesitation. Outside, emergency lights reflected faintly through the front windows. Help had arrived. But before the first responder even entered the building, everyone inside already understood something important. The woman they had dismissed as ordinary had become the steady center of the entire room. And for at least one person watching from the shadows near the back wall, that realization carried even more meaning than anyone else could possibly know. The paramedics entered quickly but calmly, carrying equipment and moving with the confidence of people who had handled situations like this many times before. Emily immediately provided a clear summary of everything she had observed since Walter began feeling unwell. Her explanation was organized, concise, and professional. One of the paramedics nodded appreciatively while taking notes. Another began speaking with Walter directly. Within moments, the team had all the information they needed to continue care. Frank watched the exchange with amazement. He had known Emily for less than an hour, yet she communicated with the responders as if they had worked together for years. Around the room, people who had never paid attention to the demands of healthcare work were witnessing a side of the profession they rarely saw. There were no dramatic speeches, no attempts to impress anyone, just competence, preparation, and responsibility. Walter appeared more alert now. He even managed a faint smile when Emily reassured him that help had arrived. The sight seemed to relax the entire room. As the paramedics prepared to transport him for further evaluation, Walter reached out and gently touched Emily's arm. "Thank you," he said quietly. Emily smiled. "You are welcome. Take care of yourself." Several nearby customers exchanged looks. The gratitude in Walter's voice was impossible to miss. Whatever opinions people had entered the evening with, many of them were beginning to change. As the medical team carefully escorted Walter outside, conversations slowly resumed. But the tone was very different now. People spoke more softly, more thoughtfully. The earlier arrogance that had filled part of the room seemed to have disappeared. Frank returned behind the counter and shook his head. "I think everyone here owes you a round of applause," he said with a smile. Emily laughed awkwardly. "That is not necessary." "Maybe not," Frank replied, "but you earned it." A few customers nodded in agreement. Emily appreciated the kindness, but attention made her uncomfortable. She had not helped Walter for recognition. To her, it was simply what needed to be done. She returned to her stool, hoping the evening might finally settle down. For a few minutes, it seemed as though it would. Then one voice disrupted the fragile peace. "Well, I guess she got lucky." The comment came from one of the men who had spent most of the night mocking her profession. Several heads immediately turned. The room grew quiet once again. The man forced a laugh and looked around for support from his friends, but the reaction he expected never came. Instead, people stared at him in disbelief. Even some of his own companions appeared uncomfortable. Emily sighed quietly. She was too tired for another argument. Before she could respond, one of the man's friends leaned toward him and whispered something that caused him to look away. Yet the damage was done. The room had heard him. Frank's expression hardened. He was about to step in when a calm voice spoke from the back of the bar. That was not luck. The words were not loud. In fact, they were spoken so evenly that they almost seemed casual. Yet every person in the room heard them. Heads turned toward the man in the dark jacket. For the first time all evening, he rose from his seat. He was tall, composed, and carried himself with quiet confidence. Nothing about his posture suggested anger. Yet something about his presence immediately commanded attention. He took a few slow steps forward. The room fell silent. Emily looked at him for the first time that night. She recognized him as the stranger who had been sitting alone near the back wall. There was something familiar about the way he carried himself, though she could not place it. The man stopped a few feet away and looked directly at the group. His expression remained calm. "What you just saw," he said, "was preparation meeting responsibility." No one interrupted him. No one laughed. For reasons nobody could fully explain, the atmosphere shifted the moment he began speaking. And without realizing it, everyone in the room had just turned their attention toward the one person who had been quietly observing everything from the very beginning. The stranger's words settled over the room with surprising weight. Nobody challenged him. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Even the man who had made the comment about luck seemed uncertain how to respond. The stranger glanced briefly toward Emily before returning his attention to the group. "People like to celebrate results," he said. "They see someone step in during an emergency and assume it happened naturally. What they do not see are the years behind that moment." His voice remained calm, but every sentence seemed deliberate. "They do not see the early mornings, the long shifts, the missed holidays, the difficult decisions, or the responsibility that comes with knowing someone else's well-being may depend on you." Several customers nodded quietly. Frank folded his arms and listened. The stranger was not raising his voice. He was not trying to embarrass anyone. Yet somehow he commanded the room more effectively than people who shouted ever could. The man who had mocked Emily earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was only joking," he said. The stranger acknowledged the statement with a small nod. "Maybe you were." He paused. "But there is something worth remembering. When a real emergency happens, people stop caring about titles. They stop caring about assumptions. They stop caring about stereotypes. They care about competence." The room remained silent. Emily found herself studying the stranger more carefully. There was a quiet authority in everything he did. He stood comfortably, never appearing aggressive or confrontational, yet nobody seemed eager to interrupt him. It reminded her of senior physicians she had worked with over the years. The best leaders rarely needed to announce themselves. Their presence alone was enough. One of the younger customers near the bar spoke up. "You sound like you have seen a few emergencies yourself." A faint smile crossed the stranger's face. "A few." The answer drew a soft laugh from several people. For the first time all evening, the tension began to ease. Even so, the earlier group appeared noticeably subdued. The events of the night had clearly forced them to reconsider their assumptions. Emily appreciated that. She did not need an apology. She simply hoped people would think differently the next time they met a nurse, a teacher, a firefighter, or anyone else whose value was not always obvious from the outside. Frank placed a glass of water in front of the stranger. "I think half the room wants to know who you are," he said. The stranger chuckled softly. "I doubt that." "I do," someone called out from another table. Several others agreed. The stranger looked around the room and seemed almost amused by the sudden attention. "My name is Ryan Walker," he said. The name meant nothing to most people present. Emily nodded politely. "Ryan Walker. Simple enough." Yet Frank's expression changed instantly. His eyes widened in recognition. "Wait a second," Frank said. "Ryan Walker?" Ryan looked at him. "Yes." Frank stared for a moment. "The training center outside Virginia Beach?" Ryan sighed as if he had hoped to avoid exactly this conversation. "That is one of the places where I work." A murmur spread through the room. Several customers exchanged confused looks. One person reached for a phone. Another whispered something to a friend. Emily noticed the reaction immediately. Clearly, Ryan was not just another customer stopping by for a quiet drink after work. Frank shook his head in disbelief. "You train special operations candidates, do you not?" Ryan gave a modest nod. "Sometimes." The understatement caused a few people to laugh. Yet the reaction around the room continued growing. The same people who had ignored Ryan for hours were suddenly looking at him very differently. Emily watched the change unfold and realized something important. The evening was no longer only about a nurse who had been underestimated. Another layer of the story was beginning to reveal itself, and judging by the expressions around the room, Ryan Walker was far more extraordinary than he seemed determined to admit. The reaction around the bar continued to spread. A few customers quietly searched Ryan's name on their phones. Others simply watched him with growing curiosity. Ryan, however, seemed completely uninterested in the attention. He took his seat again and reached for his water as though nothing significant had happened. That alone impressed Emily. She had met plenty of people who enjoyed talking about their accomplishments. Ryan appeared determined to do the opposite. Frank leaned against the counter and laughed softly. You left out a few details when you introduced yourself. Ryan shrugged. The details are not important. Maybe not to you, Frank replied. But they are to everyone else. One of the customers looked up from his phone. It says here you have trained military personnel for years. Ryan nodded once. Part of my job. Part of your job? Another customer repeated. That sounds like saying a firefighter occasionally uses water. The room chuckled. Ryan smiled politely, but offered no further explanation. Emily found herself amused by the situation. For someone whose presence seemed capable of controlling an entire room, Ryan clearly preferred staying in the background. That made her trust him more. The loudest people were rarely the strongest leaders. One of the men from the earlier group cleared his throat. He seemed uncomfortable, but he finally gathered enough courage to speak. Listen, he said, looking toward Emily. I think we owe you an apology. The room grew quiet again. Emily turned toward him. The man glanced briefly at his friends before continuing. We were making assumptions. We should not have done that. His tone sounded sincere. The confidence he had displayed earlier was gone. In its place was something much more genuine. Emily appreciated that. Thank you, she said. I accept. The simple exchange seemed to release some of the remaining tension in the room. Several people smiled. Others nodded approvingly. It was not a dramatic moment, but it felt important. Respect had finally replaced mockery. Ryan observed the conversation without interruption. After a moment, he spoke. Most people make assumptions sometimes. The important thing is what happens after you realize you were wrong. The group listened carefully. Character is not measured by whether you make mistakes, Ryan continued. Character is measured by whether you learn from them. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. The words carried weight because they were delivered without judgment. Emily noticed that every time Ryan spoke, people became more attentive. It was not fear. It was trust. Somewhere along the way, the entire room had begun viewing him as a leader. Frank shook his head. You know, if I had not recognized your name, you probably would have walked out of here without anybody knowing who you were. Ryan laughed softly. That was the plan. More laughter followed. For the first time all evening, the atmosphere felt relaxed. Conversations resumed. People returned to their tables. Yet many continued glancing toward Emily and Ryan. The events of the night had transformed two strangers into the center of attention without either one seeking it. A few minutes later, the front door opened. A police officer stepped inside. Several customers recognized him immediately. He had been one of the officers who responded to calls in the area for years. Frank greeted him with a smile. Everything is fine, he said before the officer could ask. Just checking on Walter? The officer nodded. That is right. The paramedics updated us. Sounds like somebody here helped him before they arrived. Several people immediately looked toward Emily. The officer followed their gaze. Then I would like to say thank you. Emily smiled modestly. I was just doing what anyone in my position would do. The officer looked unconvinced. Maybe, but not everyone would have done it as well. Then his eyes shifted across the room and landed on Ryan. The officer paused. A look of recognition crossed his face almost instantly. He laughed in disbelief. Well, now the whole evening makes a lot more sense. The room fell silent once again. Ryan closed his eyes briefly and shook his head as if he already knew exactly what was coming next. Ryan opened his eyes and released a quiet breath, while several customers laughed. The police officer walked forward with a grin that suggested he had known Ryan for years. I should have guessed you would be involved somehow, the officer said. Ryan shook his head. I was not involved. Emily handled the situation. The officer nodded respectfully toward her. That does not surprise me. But I also know you do not usually speak up unless there is a reason. The exchange only increased everyone's curiosity. Frank leaned across the counter. All right, somebody needs to explain what I am missing. The officer laughed. You mean besides the fact that one of the best trainers in the country has been sitting in your bar all night pretending to be invisible? Several people exchanged surprised looks. Ryan looked as though he wanted the floor to open beneath him. Emily could not help smiling. For someone with such an impressive reputation, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable being the center of attention. The officer continued. I have attended leadership seminars where people talked about this guy for an hour. The funny part is that every story sounded the same. Ryan immediately raised a hand. Please do not. That only encouraged the room further. Every story, someone asked. The officer nodded. Every single one. Different people. Different situations. Same lesson. Stay calm. Stay prepared. Take responsibility. He pointed toward Emily. Sounds familiar, does it not? Several customers immediately nodded. Emily felt a little embarrassed by the attention, but she understood the connection. Throughout the evening, Ryan had not praised himself once. Instead, he had consistently highlighted preparation, discipline, and service. Those same values had guided her entire career. One of the younger customers leaned forward. So what exactly do you train people to do? Ryan smiled politely. I teach them how to perform under pressure. The answer sounded simple, but the room became quiet again. Everyone understood that performing under pressure was easier to describe than accomplish. Frank chuckled. After tonight, I think we all got a demonstration. Ryan shook his head. No. You watched Emily perform under pressure. That is what matters. The statement immediately redirected attention back to her. Emily looked down, trying to hide a smile. She was not used to receiving praise from strangers, especially not from someone whose opinion clearly carried weight. The officer nodded thoughtfully. You know, that is probably why people respect you. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Why? Because every time somebody tries to talk about your accomplishments, you start talking about somebody else's. Laughter spread through the room. Even Ryan laughed at that. The observation was impossible to deny. A woman seated near the window spoke up. I think there is a lesson in all of this. Several people looked toward her. Earlier tonight, people saw a nurse and assumed they knew everything about her. Then they saw a quiet man sitting alone and assumed the same thing. She glanced at Emily and Ryan. Turns out both assumptions were wrong. The room fell silent for a moment. It was the kind of silence that came when people recognized a truth they had experienced firsthand. The group of men who had started the evening making jokes appeared especially reflective. One of them nodded slowly. That is fair. Another added, more than fair. Emily noticed something remarkable. Nobody seemed interested in arguing anymore. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. The entire atmosphere of the bar had changed. The emergency had revealed character. The conversations afterward had revealed perspective. What began as a routine Friday night had become something much more memorable. The officer checked his phone and smiled. Good news. Walter is doing well. Relief immediately spread through the room. Several customers applauded softly. Frank grinned. Emily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. That was the outcome she had hoped for from the beginning. The officer slipped his phone away. Looks like he is going to be just fine. The announcement seemed to lift the final trace of tension from the evening. Yet as people relaxed and conversations resumed, many continued glancing toward Emily and Ryan. Not because of their professions, not because of their reputations, but because they had demonstrated something rare. In a room full of strangers, they had quietly shown what real leadership looked like, and nobody who witnessed it was likely to forget it anytime soon. As the evening settled into a calmer rhythm, people seemed reluctant to leave. The emergency was over, Walter was safe, and the tension had disappeared, yet many customers remained where they were, talking quietly about everything they had witnessed. Frank moved behind the counter refilling drinks and shaking his head every few minutes as though he still could not believe how much had happened in a single night. Emily finally allowed herself to relax. For the first time since Walter had needed help, she felt the weight of her 12-hour shift returning. She rested her hands around her glass and looked toward the front windows where the flashing lights had disappeared. Knowing that Walter was doing well brought her a sense of relief that was difficult to describe. Across the room, Ryan remained exactly as he had been all evening. Despite the attention he had received, he seemed determined to return to the background. A few customers approached him with questions, but he answered briefly and always redirected the conversation toward other people. Emily noticed the pattern immediately. Whenever someone praised him, he talked about teamwork. Whenever someone mentioned leadership, he talked about responsibility. Whenever someone asked about his accomplishments, he spoke about the people he had trained. It was a rare quality, and it explained why so many people respected him. Frank eventually walked over carrying 2 fresh glasses of water. He placed one in front of Emily and one in front of Ryan. On the house, he said. That seems fair after tonight. Emily laughed. Water is free. Then it is the most generous offer I can afford, Frank replied. The 3 shared a laugh. For a moment, the evening felt surprisingly normal again. Then one of the men from the earlier group approached their table. His friends followed a few steps behind. The man looked nervous, not because anyone had intimidated him, but because he genuinely wanted to make things right. He looked at Emily first. "I know I already apologized," he said, "but I wanted to do it face to face." Emily nodded. "I appreciate that." The man took a breath. "My sister is a nurse." He shook his head and looked embarrassed. "If she had heard the things I said tonight, she probably would have been furious with me." Ryan smiled slightly. "Probably." A few people nearby laughed. The man smiled as well. "The truth is, I never really thought about what nurses deal with. I guess I just took it for granted." Emily appreciated the honesty. "A lot of people do," she said. "That does not make them bad people. Sometimes they just do not see what happens behind the scenes." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I saw it tonight." His friends agreed. One of them added, "So did the rest of us." As they walked away, Frank watched them with amusement. That might be the first time in history a group left this place wiser than when they arrived. Ryan chuckled. "People are capable of surprising you." Emily looked at him. "You seem pretty confident about that." Ryan considered the comment. "Because I have spent years watching people grow. Most people want to do the right thing. Sometimes they just need the chance to see things differently." The answer stayed with Emily. It sounded simple, but it explained much of what she had witnessed throughout the evening. Ryan had never tried to embarrass anyone. He had never tried to win an argument. Instead, he had quietly guided people toward a better perspective. The result had been far more powerful. As the clock moved closer to midnight, customers slowly began preparing to leave. Yet before the night could finally end, a message arrived that would bring the story full circle and remind everyone why the events of the evening mattered far beyond the walls of the bar. The message arrived through Frank's phone just as several customers were preparing to head home. He glanced down at the screen, smiled broadly, and immediately looked toward Emily. "You are going to want to hear this," he said. The room grew quiet once more. Frank cleared his throat. "Walter's daughter just called. She spoke with the hospital staff. They expect him to make a full recovery." A wave of relief swept through the bar. Several people applauded. Others smiled and exchanged grateful looks. For Emily, it was the best news she could have received. Everything else that had happened that evening suddenly seemed secondary. The recognition, the apologies, the unexpected attention, none of it mattered as much as knowing Walter was going to be all right. Frank continued reading. "She also asked me to thank the nurse who helped her father before the paramedics arrived." Emily lowered her eyes modestly while a few customers clapped again. Ryan remained quiet, watching the reaction around the room. He seemed far more interested in the good outcome than in any of the conversations that had followed. The police officer smiled. "Looks like your shift is not officially over until midnight." Emily laughed. "That is starting to feel true." A few minutes later, customers began leaving in earnest. Some stopped to shake Emily's hand. Others thanked her for what she had done. A surprising number admitted they had never fully understood what nurses faced every day. Each conversation was respectful, genuine. The change from earlier in the evening could not have been more dramatic. Eventually, only a handful of people remained. Frank was cleaning glasses behind the counter. The police officer had left. The group that had started the trouble earlier had gone home after offering one final apology. The bar felt quieter now, more peaceful. Emily gathered her things and prepared to leave. She had another shift waiting for her in the morning, and she knew sleep would be in short supply. Before heading toward the door, she walked over to Ryan. "I never really thanked you," she said. Ryan looked surprised. "For what?" "For speaking up when you did." Ryan smiled. "You did not need me to speak up." Emily considered that for a moment. "Maybe not, but I am still glad you did." Ryan nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes people hear a message better when it comes from someone they do not expect. Emily smiled. "You seem to know a lot about people." "Only because I have spent years learning from them." For a moment, neither said anything. Then Ryan reached into his pocket and handed her a simple business card. There was no elaborate title printed across it, just his name and contact information. Emily looked at it curiously. "What is this for?" Ryan shrugged. "In case you ever need anything. Advice. A recommendation. A conversation after a difficult shift." The offer felt sincere. Not formal. Not transactional. Simply genuine. Emily slipped the card into her purse. "Thank you." As they walked toward the exit, Frank called out from behind the counter. "Before you both disappear, I want to say something." They turned toward him. Frank smiled. "I have owned this place for nearly 20 years. I have seen championship celebrations, retirement parties, and every kind of Friday night you can imagine. But I do not think I have ever seen a better reminder that you cannot judge people by appearances. Nobody spoke for a moment. The statement captured the entire evening perfectly. Emily had been dismissed because of assumptions. Ryan had been overlooked because of assumptions. Yet when it mattered, both had revealed qualities nobody expected. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. Emily and Ryan stepped onto the sidewalk beneath the glow of the streetlights. The parking lot was nearly empty. After everything that had happened, the silence felt refreshing. Emily looked back once toward the bar. Earlier that evening, she had walked through those doors hoping for 30 minutes of peace after a long shift. Instead, she had witnessed how quickly people could change when given the chance to see the truth. Ryan opened the door to his truck and smiled. "Take care of yourself, Emily." "You too, Ryan." As they drove away in opposite directions, both carried the same lesson from that unforgettable night. Real strength rarely announces itself. Real character rarely demands attention. And the people most worth respecting are often the ones the world notices last.